The mobile client for old-school Runescape features the ability to limit your in-game frame rate. Now, why would you want to do this, you may ask? Aside from having a more consistent experience if you have a less powerful device, lowering the frame rate should also give you a better battery life. Now, I say should because, of course, it's never that simple. For this video, I measured the battery life of my old iPhone on 4 different frame rates to put this idea to the test. The phone we have here today is an iPhone 6s. Released in late 2015, this phone was powered by the Apple A9 system on a chip, which is a very powerful chip for its time. While this one I have here is running an older iOS, this phone can still be updated to the latest iOS over 6 years later. Better yet, after all this time, this phone is actually still powerful enough to hit 60 frames per second in almost all the areas in this game, though some frame rate dips can happen in certain places. Knowing this is probably one of the better phones to test because this can give us a wide range of results. Because targeting 60 frames per second, which is the highest available option to us, would mean putting the A9 close to full utilization. With this in mind, we should see a clear pattern of scaling across the different frame rates. As for my testing methodology, I ran a test for each available frame rate that you can select. One at 60, one at 30, one at 20, and one at 15. The tests all took place at the northwestern crab spot in Mossel Island. I chose this spot because of the ease of use and a relatively demanding load on the GPU. I also recorded these results during the Shattered Leagues, and I needed to grind my stats up for a 10 HP fight cave, so this ended up working out after all. So you're probably wondering, why would adjusting the frame rate affect battery life? One of the most power-hungry components in any computing device is the graphics processing unit. It's also known as the GPU. You might have heard of it. The job of the GPU is to visualize, or in other words render, the graphics of any application that you may be running. In our case, the GPU is outputting everything that we see in old-school Runescape. From the 2D sprites, from the 3D graphics, everything. To be able to see things in motion, the GPU must render all of the elements to the screen and put it together in a picture called a frame. The frame rate is the number of frames that is shown in a given second. Think of what you see in a game as like a flipbook being drawn and animated in real time. The higher the frame rate, the smoother the animation. If there is no limit set on the frame rate, then the GPU will work its very hardest to render as many frames as it can. However, if there is a limit on the frame rate, then the GPU will only work as hard as necessary to hit that limit. Remember, the GPU is one of those power-hungry components in a computing device, so if the GPU is able to work less, then it will draw less power, therefore giving better battery life. I mean, right? Well, let's see. So here are the results. The test that ended the quickest was the 60 frames per second test. Given what we know, this makes sense since it's the highest frame rate. At 60 FPS, the iPhone lasted for about 2 hours, 24 minutes, and 57 seconds, from full to dead. Next up was the 30 frames per second test. As you can see, it lasted a lot longer. This time went on for 3 hours and 42 minutes. Over 53% longer than the 60 FPS test. Not bad. So, this means that the 20 frames per second test is going to last even longer, right? Well, not really. This is where things get weird. Not only did it not last longer, but it only lasted for 3 hours and 15 minutes and 40 seconds, which is around 26.5 minutes less than the 30 FPS test. To put that in perspective, the Theater of Blood can be completed at a moderate pace in about 25 minutes. You can fit a whole raid in the difference between these two tests. As for the 15 frames per second test, it was only about 16 minutes longer than the 20 FPS test, but it was still around 10 minutes shorter than the 30 FPS test. So then, what's going on here? Well, there are a few things to note. First, the results are probably within margin of error with respect to how the battery life is calculated. The battery inside this iPhone is an aftermarket battery purchased from iFixit, and it was installed in September 2019. The battery reports 99% capacity in the settings, though this is probably false considering the age of the battery, and that's a third-party part. Whatever technology that Apple uses in their own batteries to report the capacity is probably not present here. This is not to say that the first-party batteries are much better. The previous two batteries were Apple batteries, and neither of them lasted more than 2.5 years. While this current battery is older than 2 years, it also hasn't seen that much regular usage due to the phone being replaced by a OnePlus 8 a year after it was installed. So while each test started from when the phone reported 100% charge, I cannot guarantee that each test actually starts from 100% charge, for the reasons mentioned. Aside from that, there's also a possible bottleneck at play here. While there are no tools I'm aware of to measure performance on iOS, my OnePlus 8 is able to measure CPU and GPU performance on the Android build. Even at 60 frames per second on the Android version, the GPU is only sitting at about 18 to 20% utilization, even at Fossil Island. Taking a look at the PC version on RuneLite, we see a similar story. Uncapping the frame rate here, using the FPS control, we can see a somewhat big bump in GPU utilization, but a jump to nearly 100% utilization on CPU Core 0. This makes sense. OSRS is a game that was built with the single-core CPUs from the early 2000s in mind, with the graphics originally rendered by the CPU as well. As a result, even with the GPU renderer, it's probably not able to take full advantage of modern computing systems, including what's in the iPhone. In addition, we can see the law of diminishing returns at play here. From 60 to 30 FPS, there are 30 less frames per second for the iPhone to push, but going from 30 to 15, there's only 15 less frames for the game to run at. Finally, only one test was run per frame rate. More tests will most certainly paint a clear picture of the results. However, given how long these tests take, that's going to be pretty difficult to do, especially since automating these tests in any way, shape, or form can get me banned from the game. Because, botting. So in conclusion, from the given data, lowering the frame rate can definitely improve the battery life on an older phone, like the iPhone 6s. However, after a certain point, the duration will vary within margin of error. In this case, anything that is 30 frames per second or below will offer a substantial increase to battery life over 60 FPS. Improvements range from 51 minutes to nearly an hour and a half. However, at 30 FPS and lower, this pattern starts to change. Lowering the frame rate beyond this point does not guarantee more battery life, since the 30 FPS tests lasted longer than the 15 and 20 FPS tests. Once again, more tests could paint a better picture of this situation. And lastly, this test was conducted on an iPhone 6s, a phone that is relatively ancient compared to modern phones. Remember, the A9, a chip that's nearly 7 years old in design. Since it's nowhere near as efficient as today's SoCs, there's no guarantee that newer phones will have the same exact results. As of the making of this video, there is currently a beta of the Android client with all sorts of new features. Would you like to see a test of this one? Let me know in the comments below. And that's it for today's video. I hope you learned something just like I did.